Let's see now. We have on our team, we have who's on first, what's on second, I don't know who's on third.
That's what I want to find out, the guy's name. That's what I want to find out, the guy's name.
I'm telling you, who's on first, what's on second, I don't know who's on third.
Estamos pasávamos yo y mi hermana la grande Victoria 10 años. Cuando acabó la guerra, mi padre turnó.
Çünkü bazı hani elektrikler şeyler olmuyor. O zaman ne yapacaksın? Mecbur ışıldıyla çağıracaksın.
Today's video is about the connection between language and sound. It's a commonly held belief that languages are sound-based or somehow languages depend on sound in some way, when in fact, that's not the case. The truth is that languages have very little to do with sound. Sound does play an interesting role in languages, but actually it's a fairly minor part of language in comparison to other things. And so in today's video, I will provide you evidence supporting that and perhaps make some suggestions regarding how you can use this information to improve your learning of foreign languages. So let's begin. There are millions upon millions of people in the world who speak as a first language, a sign language. In fact, their only language may be a sign language. What does that mean? It means that instead of moving their vocal cords to communicate, they move their hands and their arms and their fingers, etc. Let's say that Sally and John are both speakers of the same sign language and are sitting together and talking with their hands. And Sally wants to communicate something to John. Let's say she wants him to bring her some water in from the kitchen. And so she moves her hands in such a way that if we translated those movements into English, it would mean something like, "Hey John, can you get me some water from the kitchen?" And so then John gets up and goes to the kitchen and brings her water. Great, perfect, good friends. But let's deconstruct what actually is happening in a scenario like this. What's happening is Sally is moving her hands and her fingers and her body, which means she's moving her muscles, doesn't it? And John is doing what? Well, he's seeing this with his eyes and then understands conventional meaning associated with certain kinds of movements. Great, but there's something deeper here. What does it mean that John is seeing this? Well, what it means is that photons are bouncing off of Sally's hands and John is seeing these photons, and that's how the information gets from Sally's body into John's brain, by moving her hands and by relying on reflected photons. What does this have to do with spoken languages? Well, spoken languages are not that different. In spoken language, how do two people get information to one another? They don't necessarily rely on photons, although it is true that when you're sitting across from somebody, it is easier to understand them than when you're just hearing them, say, over the phone. But importantly, and here's where the confusion comes from, when two people are speaking to one another, a spoken language, they're relying on sound as the medium. Just like Sally and John rely on photons as the proxy for their muscle movements, in spoken languages, we rely on sound waves as the proxy for muscle movements. What this means is that in your brain, all the linguistic units that you know, nouns, adjectives, verbs, tone, things like this, are stored in your mind not as little sound waves, little sound files, little waveforms. They're stored as muscle movements. And this makes sense from many different perspectives. First of all, it does not make a lot of sense to say that languages are stored as sound information, because it means that, say, when you go to speak, you have to do a lot of processing to take all those little sound bites in your head and convert them into muscle movements and send them right over to the person across from you, who will immediately understand them because they have the sound stored as sound waves. But then when they want to reply, they have to do all that processing again. It makes a lot more sense in terms of processing to say, well, everything is stored as muscle movements, and what I do is I just move my muscles to you, and that has an effect on the environment. Sometimes it's photons, sometimes it's air, and then the person across from me receives that signal and then interprets those muscle movements, either with his sight processing system or sound processing system, and then arrives at the muscle movements that caused those signals to be sent in the first place. Secondly, from an evolutionary point of view, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because you're saying that if languages are sound-based, but there's also sign languages, that we evolved two parallel ways of storing language. Sign language speakers store it as muscle movement, and then spoken language people store it as sound. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Or is the suggestion that somehow sign language speakers have their language stored as sound, but then they convert it into hand muscle movements to send it to the person who'll understand these sounds with their eyes? That doesn't make a lot of sense either. Third of all, and this is a topic which we'll have to visit more deeply in a different video, it turns out that most of the errors we commit when speaking are more easily explainable with articulatory errors. Errors in muscle movement, not errors in sound confusion. It's not that you're confusing sounds, it's that you're confusing how to move your mouth or your sound organs, like you confuse steps in dance or you confuse movements of your hands when you're playing an instrument. So a very natural question the viewer might want to ask is, why have I never heard of this? Why is it that for some reason I've always been told and always believed that languages are stored as sound? Well, the quick answer is, A, it seems intuitive that languages are stored in your head as sound because we seem to use sound for languages. But the real answer is I don't know why this isn't taught. I mean, this is fairly standard science in some fields. You can find out more about it by looking up a couple of things. One is the motor theory of speech perception, and the other one is the direct realism or the direct realist approach to speech perception. Ultimately, the idea being that the information about language is stored in the brain in the same terms as the information we use to actually do language, which means moving your vocal cords, moving your hands, whatever is the case. Okay, so here we come to the advice section of this video. To begin with, let's quickly review what we learned. We learned that in spoken languages, sound is a proxy for how we're really storing information. We're storing information as muscle movement, just like we do in most human activities. How can we use this information to improve the way we learn foreign languages? Well, it turns out that as adults, what's going on is when we try to learn a foreign language and we hear their sounds, most people, but not all people, most people try to correlate the sound they heard with sort of the nearest possible muscle movement that produces a similar sound in the language that they speak. Sort of like, let me give you a story to provide some analogy. It's something like this. When I was in England in 2007, I was on a bus one time and I gave somebody the peace symbol, like this, because that's the peace symbol. 2 fingers up, done. However, in England, there's a nuance that I was unaware of. In fact, this is the peace symbol, and this, as you know, is something very different. It's an insult, which has a lot of folk history attached to it. I didn't know this, and the person I did this to assumed that I did know the difference, and I was just playing coy. I was just being funny or difficult. It turns out there's nuance. This muscle movement means one thing, this muscle movement means something different in England, whereas in America, these muscle movements mean the same thing. They carry the same information. So when you're learning a foreign language, and you hear a muscle movement say, but you're an American speaker, what does mean to you? Well, for some people it means oo, and for some people it means o, but it does not mean doesn't mean anything. For example, there's a common name in Turkey, Özlem, and my friend Claire, who's from England, doesn't call Özlem, she calls her Uzlem. Sometimes when I'm irritated, I say, her name is Özlem. She'll say, oh, Özlem. Just does not correlate that sound with the right muscle movement. So to learn a foreign language, especially if you're not quite good at picking up on dialects, you don't have a good ear, as it were, really what you don't have is a good human sound to muscle movement translation device in your head. If you don't have a good ear, then what it means that you have to do is you have to get professional advice or technical advice. And the question is, here's this sound I always confuse, here's this sound I don't understand, how do I make that sound? Trying to learn a foreign language by ear is like learning tap dance by ear. You can probably get a lot more information by watching a tap dancer, listening to a tap dancer, than trying it yourself. How quickly, you could probably still learn tap dancing if you were blind. In fact, there must be tons of blind tap dancers actually. But it might be easier in some ways to do it if you can see, or if someone's, say, moving your legs and showing you how to position your legs. It's the same thing is true with learning foreign languages. You could learn it if you're blind, plenty of people have, but it's probably easier if someone is telling you how to move your mouth. So for example, how do you say the in Özlem's name? Well, the in Özlem's name is really like the in get in English, so just make an in English, your reference point is but instead of smiling, you purse your lips, Özlem, Özlem. And you go from there. Is an approximation, you learn to tweak it. How about the French You know, it's it is a sweet sound. It is Well, how do you make the of French? Well, if you speak English, you just make the E as in seed, and then instead of smiling your E, you purse your E. Really, French is kind of a pursed language, if you will. That's not true. It's a joke. So the fact that in your brain you store your sound is stored not as sound, rather as articulations, means that you can leverage this information, you can use this information to get direct advice from the right people as to how to pronounce, how to move your tongue or your throat or your lips or whatever the articulators are in order to better speak a foreign language. Because, just like dance, just like drumming, the better you move your body parts, the closer they are to the way it should be, the better you understand what they're doing, the more nuance you can put into it. It's that simple. The better you understand tap dance, the more nuance you can put into tap dance. The more you understand the tap dance, if you will, of a foreign language, how they're articulating, the subtler and the more fine-tuning you can do. And this, by the way, explains why children sound funny at a young age, and sometime in their teenage years, they start sounding kind of like normal adults. There's physiological reasons for that, too. The children's articulators haven't even fully ossified yet. They're still mushy. But anyway, it's because it takes a long time to fine-tune that dance, because you have very little visual information, and it is a trial and error thing at the end of the day. Yes, that's that. Well, that's another unexpected jump cut. Here I am. Now I'm in Istanbul. Most of this was scripted and recorded, and a lot of it was drawn in the United States. And I haven't had the time in the last month or 2 months to get as much of it done as I wanted. Plus, I released that video on Psycads, which was more urgent and equally fun. I hope that you learned something from this video. Ultimately, the key thing to take home is that your knowledge of the words I'm saying right now is not stored in your head as little sound waves or little sound bites, but rather muscle movement, like most of your knowledge is stored. I wonder how mathematical knowledge is stored. Anyway, I'm not a neurologist. I'm barely a linguist. So there are definitely mistakes in this, or at least things that could be explained better, or perhaps I oversimplified some things. I mean, it is a 14-minute video after all. So I invite you to make comments to improve the conversation, to make corrections. If you'd like to, find out more about this, I'm gonna down in the doobly-doo. I have links for places you can go to learn more about this. Okay, well that's basically the whole video. Perhaps I repeated myself a lot of times, but that's how you learn, and at least that's how I feel better. Comment, improve my video, suggest things, etc., etc. Thank you for watching it. Have a great day, etc.